Hi, I'm Amy Goodman. In this critical election year, you count on Democracy Now! To stay focused on the stories that matter most. And we count on you to support our independent journalism. If everyone who tunes into Democracy Now! Signed up for a monthly donation of, say, just $6, we could cover our operating costs for the entire year. Really, that's all it would take. Please do your part today by visiting us at democracynow.org. Stay safe. Wear a mask, save lives, and thank you so much. From New York, this is Democracy Now!
There hasn't actually been such a significant attack on the freedom of the press, the First Amendment, which is the bedrock of our republic, really our form of government, since my case in 1971.
Pentagon Papers whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg testifies at the extradition hearing of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, urging Britain not to send him to the United States, where he faces 175 years behind bars. We'll find out why. But first, we speak to award-winning Sudanese journalist Naima El-Bahir about her stunning new CNN expose. It's called Yemen, a crisis made in America.
In previous CNN investigations, we traced serial numbers on armaments in Yemen back to arms deals between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the US, proving that the US government has profited from the chaos of the war in Yemen. And aid agencies tell us the aid drawdown threatens to wreak even more havoc.
Plus, we go to the Greek island of Lesbos, where 13,000 migrants were left homeless after a fire destroyed their unsanitary, dangerous camp, most of Europe's largest refugee camp.
We urge
the Greek government to let us get out of here because life is tough here. We have experienced hunger and thirst here. It has been for days that I didn't drink clean water and I didn't have food. I'm searching for water. Otherwise, our children and I will die of thirst.
All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The head of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention warned Wednesday U.S. residents should not expect to receive a vaccine for the coronavirus until at least mid-2021, contradicting President Trump's claim at least 100 million doses could be distributed by the end of 2020. Dr. Robert Redfield was speaking at a Senate hearing on the federal government's response to the COVID pandemic.
If you're asking me when is it going to be generally available to the American public, so we can begin to take advantage of vaccine to get back to our regular life, I think we're probably looking at late second quarter, third quarter, 2021.
President Trump lashed out at Dr. Redfield, telling reporters in the White House press briefing room the top U.S. public official misspoke.
I think he made a mistake when he said that. It's just incorrect information. And I called him, and he didn't tell me that, and I think he got the message, maybe confused.
Trump also contradicted the CDC director, Dr. Redfield, over masks, saying a vaccine would be much more effective than facial coverings at stopping the spread of the coronavirus. His comment came after Dr. Redfield estimated a potential coronavirus vaccine might only be 70% effective at generating an immune response, making widespread mask use critical to ending the pandemic in the future.
Face masks, these face masks are the most important, powerful public health tool we have. And I will continue to appeal for all Americans, all individuals in our country, to embrace these face coverings. I've said it, if we did it for 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, we'd bring this pandemic under control.
Meanwhile, President Trump acknowledged at least one White House staffer tested positive for the coronavirus on Wednesday. White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany refused to name who was infected, but said high-level delegations from Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel, who gathered at the White House Tuesday, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, were not affected. On Wednesday, Israeli journalists who returned home from covering the White House event were ordered to quarantine and submit to an epidemiological investigation. Israel's the first country in the world to go to a second national lockdown this weekend. The United States reported nearly 1,000 new coronavirus fatalities Wednesday, with the official U.S. death toll nearing 197,000, by far the worst in the world. Nearly 40,000 new cases of COVID-19 were confirmed over the last 24 hours, many of them driven by large outbreaks on college campuses. On Wednesday, members of the Big Ten College Athletics Conference reversed course and said the fall football season will proceed this year, even as they acknowledge many players will contract COVID-19 as a result. President Trump celebrated the announcement, tweeting, "It is my great honor to have helped," unquote. Big Ten institutions said they would establish a cardiac registry for infected student athletes, writing, quote, "The registry and associated data will attempt to answer many of the unknowns regarding the cardiac manifestations in COVID-19 positive elite athletes," unquote. In response, sports law professor Alicia Jessup tweeted, "The U.S. has an ugly history when it comes to medical research in the black community, from the Tuskegee syphilis study to the use of Henrietta Lacks cancer cells unknowingly by her. If the Big Ten did not receive informed consent from players, it will add to this litany," unquote. Globally, confirmed coronavirus cases are rapidly approaching 30 million, with over 940,000 recorded deaths from COVID-19. India recorded nearly 98,000 positive cases over the last 24 hours, the highest one-day toll for any country since the start of the pandemic. Meanwhile, Oxfam reports a small group of wealthy nations, representing just 13% of the world's population, has secured contracts for more than half of the world's future supply of coronavirus vaccine. Oxfam warns this could leave 2/3 of the world's population without access to a vaccine until at least 2022. On the Gulf Coast of the United States, at least one person was killed and over 500,000 customers were left without power as Hurricane Sally brought torrential rains and severe flooding to coastal communities from the Florida Panhandle to Mississippi. In Pensacola, a section of 3 Mile Bridge was destroyed after a barge slammed into the structure, cutting off access to the city of Gulf Breeze. Officials say parts of Florida received 4 months' worth of rain in just 4 hours. Attorney General William Barr told federal prosecutors to consider bringing sedition charges against protesters who destroy property, accusing them of plotting the overthrow of the U.S. government. That's according to the Wall Street Journal, which also reports Barr asked the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division to consider bringing criminal charges against Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkan for allowing Black Lives Matter protesters to set up a police-free zone in Seattle. The American Civil Liberties Union condemned Barr's remarks, writing in a statement, "Treating protest as a form of sedition won't stand up in court, but that is clearly not the point here. This is a tyrannical and un-American attempt to suppress demands for racial justice and an end to police violence," the ACLU wrote. This comes as the Washington Post reports the Pentagon's top military police officer sought to deploy a microwave heat ray weapon against protesters in Washington, D.C.'s Lafayette Square as Black Lives Matter protests spread to the doorstep of the White House in early June. Meanwhile, Attorney General William Barr Wednesday compared stay-at-home orders during the pandemic to a form of house arrest, saying, quote, "Other than slavery, this is the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history." Michael Caputo, the top spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services, has announced he'll take a 60-day leave of absence for medical reasons. Caputo has faced calls to resign after accusing government scientists of, quote, sedition, claiming there was a, quote, resistance unit inside the CDC attempting to undermine Trump. Caputo is a longtime associate of Roger Stone, who was appointed to his post at HHS despite having no health care background. CNN is reporting acting Homeland Security Secretary Chad Wolf is expected to defy a House subpoena to testify today. This comes just days after a federal judge ruled Wolf is likely serving unlawfully as acting secretary. On Capitol Hill, Senate Republicans Wednesday confirmed 2 more of President Trump's judicial nominees to lifetime appointments on the federal bench. David Dugan and Stephen McGlynn are both longtime opponents of reproductive freedoms, including the right to an abortion. Their confirmations came 4 months after the Democratic-controlled House passed the $3 trillion HEROES Act. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has refused to schedule a vote on the coronavirus relief bill, calling it an unserious liberal wish list. In Nebraska, a grand jury has indicted a white bar owner in Omaha in the fatal shooting of James Scurlock, a black protester. Scurlock was shot dead May 30th during protests over the killing of George Floyd. He was 22 years old. The local county attorney initially declined to bring charges, but brought the case to a grand jury. The bar owner, Jake Gardner, had claimed self-defense, but a special prosecutor said evidence from Gardner himself undermines that claim. Democratic lawmakers have called for an investigation into reports that a doctor in Georgia has been performing hysterectomies on immigrant women held at an Immigration and Customs Enforcement prison without their consent. The shocking claim first came to light in a whistleblower complaint filed by a nurse named Dawn Wooten, who works at the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. Wooten appeared on MSNBC Tuesday night.
I had several detained women on numerous occasions that would come to me and say, Miss Wooten, I had a hysterectomy. Why? I had no answers as to why they had those procedures. And one lady walked up to me here this last time around between October of 19 until July the 2nd. And she said, what is he? Is he the uterus collector? Does he collect uteruses? And I asked her, what does she mean? And she says, everybody that I talked to has had a hysterectomy.
In related news, ICE has temporarily halted the deportation of Pauline Bingham, a Cameroonian mother who says she was involuntarily sterilized while detained in Georgia. Bingham was already on the plane Wednesday when her deportation was stopped. She's lived in the United States since the age of 2. National outcry likely led to the stopping of her deportation. In other immigration news, the Trump administration has asked the Supreme Court to decide whether it can exclude undocumented immigrants from the census numbers used to determine each state's share of seats in Congress. A federal court in New York recently blocked the Trump administration from doing so. And the Caribbean nation of Barbados has announced plans to remove Britain's Queen Elizabeth as its head of state. In a statement, the government said, quote, the time has come to fully leave our colonial past behind. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by my co-host, Nermeen Shaikh. Hi, Nermeen.
Good morning, Amy, and welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.
Well, more than 9 months into the coronavirus pandemic, the United Nations is warning millions in Yemen, South Sudan, northeast Nigeria, and the Democratic Republic of Congo now face famine due to the compounding crises of economic devastation, violent conflicts, and lack of access to humanitarian aid. UN official Mark Lowcock said a lack of funding for humanitarian relief has pushed already precarious populations to the brink of starvation. In Yemen, Yemen, where 80% of the population depends on humanitarian aid, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates have all slashed aid to the country. This comes as the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition continues to bomb Yemen, where millions face hunger, disease, and extreme poverty in what's been called the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, even before the pandemic. In a moment, we'll talk about the crisis in Yemen with Sudanese journalist Naima Abagir. She was named the 2020 Royal Television Society Television Journalist of the Year. She's a senior international correspondent for CNN. But first, we're turning to her report for CNN called Yemen, a Crisis Made in America.
In this packed children's ward in the main Abs hospital in the north of Yemen, anxious mothers vie for attention as Dr. Ali Al-Ashwal does his rounds. This little girl is named Hafsa. Her mother tells the doctor Hafsa has 5 brothers, all malnourished. But Hafsa is the only one they can afford the medicine for.
Assalamu alaikum.
This mother of an 8-month-old tells Dr. Al-Ashwal her little boy can no longer lift up his head. He's too weak. His little belly is painfully swollen, a telltale sign of acute malnutrition.
This is a tragedy. A family of 10 are all squeezed into one room. 4 of our children in 3 years dead from malnutrition.
Rows and rows of hungry children, their bodies so stripped of fat that every move is agony. Hard to believe, but these are the lucky ones. These are the children whose parents can afford the car journey to the hospital.
These are all the patients we admitted. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 cases just on the first day of September.
Even for Yemen, this is not the norm. Every day brings dozens more patients.
And here you have death. Just one day after we admitted her.
And more death. This patient died this week, a 1-year-old called Fatma. It's very hard to keep track of exact figures for child deaths because so many of the children don't even make it to the hospital. All the doctor knows is that things are getting worse.
In August and September, our cases have spiked very clearly, most likely because of the withdrawal of support from the NGOs and other centers having to close due to lack of funding.
Why is that? That lack of funding Dr. Al-Ashwal was talking about. 80% of the 30 million population in Yemen is reliant on aid, the majority of whom live in the Ansarullah Houthi-controlled north. The Houthis, seeking to control the flow of aid, placed restrictions on UN agencies in areas under their control. In March, the US suspended much of its aid to the north, citing concerns over Houthi misappropriation. 2 other key donors, the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, have also drawn down. The US, UAE and Saudi Arabia have all slashed their Yemen aid spend. The US spend dropping from almost $1 billion to $411 million. Saudi from over $1 billion to half that, with only $22.8 million actually received. The UAE has given $0 to the UN's 2020 Yemen appeal. CNN was able to obtain access to a confidential internal UN briefing document. UN agencies have confirmed to us its contents. In the aftermath of the drop in foreign aid, the UN has shuttered almost 75% of its programs. In previous CNN investigations, we traced serial numbers on armaments in Yemen back to arms deals between Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and the US, proving that the US government has profited from the chaos of the war in Yemen. And aid agencies tell us the aid drawdown threatens to wreak even more havoc. Mushariya Farah pushes her disabled son in a wheelchair. Mushariya used to receive support through a UN-funded program. Now she can't even afford to get her son Asim to hospital. Malnutrition has left Asim mentally disabled, and she has to choose between feeding him or paying for treatment. She carries him through the little alley that leads to the half-finished building site where she and other displaced families have erected makeshift shelters. Up until a few months ago, she tells us Asim was like any little boy. But after the family were displaced from their home by fighting, now they live here.
I have no help. I just pray to God.
The aid suspension has driven the people of the Houthi-controlled north into deeper isolation. Yemen's north could already be in famine, and we might not even know it.
That's the CNN exclusive, Yemen, a crisis made in America. As we turn now to London, where we're joined by the journalist who produced that report. Nermeen Al-Baghir is an award-winning senior international correspondent for CNN. She was named the 2020 Royal Television Society Television Journalist of the Year. She also won an Alfred DuPont Columbia and George Polk Award. In 2018, she also received the International Center for Journalists' Excellence in International Reporting Award for her work. Nermeen, we welcome you to Democracy Now! This is a powerful report, Yemen, a crisis made in America. As you talk about the United States, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates cutting off aid to Yemen largely, yet continuing, as you report on this report and earlier ones, to find U.S. weapons on the ground in Yemen. Talk about the connection.
Well, it's a very clear connection. It's an incredibly egregious one. When the war launched 5 years ago, the U.S. backed the Saudi-led invasion after the Houthis overthrew the legitimate internationally recognized government of President Abdurrabbu Mansour Hadi. What complicated the issue is even after the Obama administration found that the Saudis and the coalition were not taking into account the impact on civilians of their deployment of U.S. weaponry, and they suspended it. When the Trump administration came in, they immediately overturned that suspension. So there was a foreknowledge of the involvement and the impact and the ways that U.S. support entrenched this conflict. But for years now, we've seen another pattern start to come together, which is not only is the U.S. profiting from the war by selling weapons to the UAE and Saudi Arabia, who are both partners in the coalition, they also, the Inspector General, who was forced out from the State Department, found continuing to not take into account the impact on civilians of that deployment of U.S. armaments by the UAE and by Saudi Arabia. We fast forward 2 or 3 years of this extraordinary controversial action, and then we start to see, we start coming across these numbers that are starting to drop. The UAE in 2017 gave $0 to the UN Humanitarian Assistance Program, even though it was an active member of the coalition. Saudi Arabia gave $1 billion, but only really after the UN at the end of last year had come back and pushed and said, Yemen is slipping into famine. So there was all this work and all this investment and all this, frankly, shaming of the US and the UAE and Saudi Arabia to force them to put right what they had made wrong on the ground in Yemen. And then in March, Secretary Pompeo, the Secretary of State, decides that they are going to suspend aid to those Houthi-controlled areas. And yes, the Houthis are obstructing aid, and it is extraordinarily egregious, but the Houthis are not the only one. This is a war in which food and starvation have been weaponized by both sides. And that's when we saw the drop. And that's when we saw the numbers. And what really spurred our reporting was that even the UN has not been able to access these areas to get a measure, a metric of whether Yemen truly is in famine. And I don't know if you know this, Amy, but famine is a very much a scientific metric point where it's 2 out of every 10,000 people dying from hunger every day. In Yemen, because so many people can't afford to even come to the hospital, they are dying at home alone and uncounted. So the world can't even respond in the ways that it would if we were able to say there was a famine. It was a very difficult report to pull together because we were trying to pull this all remotely from London because of the coronavirus and the difficulties of traveling. But I hope that we managed to get across the key message here, which is this is not a natural disaster. This is a man-made catastrophe in which our governments are complicit.
Well, Nermeen, you mentioned that a large number of people, the majority of people in Yemen, and in the report you say so as well, that the ones who make it to the hospital are the lucky ones. And in this piece, you document the ruinous state conditions in these hospitals. So could you talk about what has happened to the currency, the Yemeni rial, that has made not only food and drinking water effectively unaffordable, but also fuel, and how important fuel is to keep these medical facilities going and to keep many people, including children, alive?
So in addition to the drawdown on their aid contributions, the US has also been backing a 5-year-long blockade by the Saudi-led coalition. What that means effectively is that most of the commercial vessels that were bringing food, that were bringing goods from the outside world to Yemen, have not been able to dock at that key point of Hodeidah in the south that is so heavily contested. So that means fuel, if you can find it, is incredibly expensive. And in a way, even more tortuously, there is food, but because the currency has spiraled and been devalued so many times, and there is so little work available, people cannot afford it. We were in Yemen in January last year, before it even got this bad. And I think one of the most heartbreaking things I've witnessed personally is driving through markets that are full of food, and you see the people selling the food, the vegetables, the grains, they themselves are almost skeletal, and the food is rotting because no one can afford to buy it. And one of the stories we heard in the hospital that we didn't air, but we included in our digital write-up, which was genuinely, I think, one of the worst things I've ever heard, is that the impact of that blockade has meant that the hospitals don't have fuel. And now, because the UN cannot afford to sustain the hospitals and they're having to focus on just really life-saving measures, they're not buying them fuel. So when the electricity goes out, the equipment, the oxygen equipment, the breathing equipment that is keeping the most malnourished and the sickest children alive, that stops. And because there's no electricity, there are no monitors to raise the alarm that stopped. And one doctor who spoke to us, his voice was breaking. And he said that he had found children suffocated to death because while they're running around trying to tend to everyone in these overcrowded hospitals, if you turn your back for a moment on a child in a different room and the power goes out, that child dies. And what is so difficult and yet so extraordinary is these people continue to come to work. They turn up every day knowing that they do not have what it takes to save these children, and yet they continue to try.
And Nermeen, can you talk about the Trump administration has not only cut funding to Yemen, the Trump administration also announced earlier this year that they would cut funding to the World Health Organization. So could you talk about the work that the World Health Organization does in Yemen, has done in Yemen, and how its work will be impacted by these cuts?
Well, this has absolutely been a double whammy for Yemen, because the World Health Organization runs a lot of the malnutrition clinics, but it also runs all of the programs that are designed to battle transmittable diseases, such as the coronavirus. So they are the ones paying the doctor and nurses' salaries because the Houthi-led government in Sana'a can't afford to. But they're also the ones at the front line of the fight against the coronavirus, it is impossible. It is absolutely impossible to get any sense of the numbers of the people that have died from the coronavirus separately to the number of the people that have died from malnutrition. But because of this, I keep saying aid drawdown, and it makes it sound so clinical. It is essentially because of this strangling of the aid that gets through to the people in Yemen. It has meant that not only are they dealing with malnutrition, because the World Food Programme has halved the aid that these people receive. So not only are you getting half rations, and it's reaching half the people, but it means that people are getting food every other month. So you have to plan one meal a day. Parents are not eating so that children can eat. But then if you have the horrible misfortune of coming down with the coronavirus, there are no facilities that are able to support any kind of, I mean, we don't have a cure for the coronavirus, but even just to keep people comfortable. So one of the things that we did to get a sense of this is we started speaking to gravediggers, and even they don't have the numbers. All they can tell us is that the actual legitimate government licensed cemeteries are full. So now people are bribing gravediggers to find plots of land in places where other people cannot or will not venture, in dangerous parts of these cities, so that at the very least they can try and at least claw back some dignity in burying their loved ones effectively, rather than leaving them to rot in a mortuary somewhere.
Emma, I want to go to a briefing that Mark Lowcock, the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, gave on Tuesday to the UN Security Council. He called out the oil-rich Gulf states for turning away from the situation in Yemen.
Several donors, including the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, who have a particular responsibility which they've discharged in recent years, have so far given nothing to this year's UN plan. It is particularly reprehensible to promise money which gives people hope that that help may be on the way, and then to dash those hopes by simply failing to fulfill the promise. More than 9 million people have been affected by deepening cuts to aid programs, including food, water and healthcare. Continuing to hold back money from the humanitarian response now will be a death sentence for many families.
That's the UN Undersecretary General, Mark Lowcock. So, Naima Al-Bagir, if you can talk about, it's even wrong to say the Gulf states have turned away from Yemen. They have not turned away from Yemen. They are constantly bombing Yemen. In fact, on Tuesday, President Trump stood with the foreign minister of the United Arab Emirates. And of course, we know Saudi Arabia leads the bombs provided by the United States. And part of the deal didn't actually have to do with the Palestinians that was signed off on at the White House. It had to do with the United States selling the UAE F-35 fighter bombers. Can you talk about the significance of, once again, these weapons deals to hunger and the devastation of Yemen?
Well, it sends a message, doesn't it? It sends a message, not just in Yemen, but it sends a message around the world that you can do what you want to do as long as you sign up for our key concerns. And a number of U.S. diplomats have described to me conversations that they've had with the UAE and with Saudi Arabia. And essentially the subtext of the conversation was, well, the UAE has signed a peace deal with Israel. And we know that this is a key priority for the Trump administration. So what more do you want from us? What we know about Yemen is that Yemen, it was a national security risk for the United States. It was home to the most effective franchise of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who at one point got very far in a plot to put a bomb on a plane and send it to the United States. That was always given as the excuse for the reason why the United States need to continue to be engaged in Yemen. What has happened with allowing key U.S. allies like the UAE and Saudi Arabia to do what they have done in Yemen is that this hunger and this conflict has allowed not just Al-Qaeda, but ISIS to become resurgent in Yemen again. Just this last week, there were a number of pretty effective ISIS and Al-Qaeda attacks. The U.S. is measurably less safe because of what their allies have done in Yemen. But one of the things that is really interesting that so many of us that are covering foreign affairs are looking at really closely is that the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has now said that the chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, can begin to look into U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. And that is precedent setting, because given what the IG report, the unredacted version, shows about the U.S.'s disregard for civilian casualties perpetrated by their allies with their bombs, there is a real conversation that is beginning about whether the U.S. is opening itself up for further cases of war crime prosecution on Yemen. And it's a pretty credible case that is being discussed. And yet, any time that you bring this formally and on record to the State Department or to Trump administration officials, they say, well, this is about American manufacturers, about American workers being able to make money out of American bombs being dropped in Yemen. And what we have seen with the engagement that we have found, not just for this piece, but also for the previous investigations that we've done, is actually I take heart from this, is that so many of our audience, whether it's in America or around the world, don't believe that. They don't believe that money should be made over the deaths of innocent civilians halfway around the world in a country that was already a humanitarian disaster, even before this ill-thought-through intervention.
Nermeen, we just have 30 seconds, but we cannot leave without asking you about Sudan, where you are from, and your coverage of the women-led Sudanese uprising, but also Lowcock warning about the first famines of the coronavirus era hitting, among other places, Yemen and your own country of Sudan.
Again, this goes back to foreign policy malfeasance on the part of the Trump administration. This is an administration that continued talks to normalize with a sitting dictator in Sudan while demonstrators were being shot down in the streets. It is incredibly disheartening to see people who have risked so much be let down so badly by the United States. It really is.
Nermeen, I want to thank you so much for being with us, award-winning senior international correspondent for CNN based in London, whose Yemen report earlier this week is called Yemen, a Crisis Made in America. When we come back, we go to the Greek island of Lesbos, where 13,000 migrants have been left homeless after a fire destroyed one of Europe's largest refugee camps. Stay with us.
The sun lies in the field. Someone has killed some other son today. Head blown up by some soldier's gun, while all the mothers stand and wait. Some other son ain't coming home today. Some other son ain't got no soldiers fighting in a trench. One soldier glances up to see the sun and dreams of
Some Other Son by the Kinks. This is Democracy Now!, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh as we go to Greece, where over 10,000 refugees and migrants remain homeless a week after a fire burned down a massive refugee camp last week. Moria is Europe's largest refugee camp. The fire left nearly 13,000 refugees from Afghanistan, African countries, and Syria without access to shelter, food, or sanitation, raising concerns about a coronavirus outbreak after 35 25 refugees tested positive. Thousands are now moving into a temporary camp that officials say is ready to host at least 5,000, but others are refusing to go. They say they don't trust the facility. This comes as 4 Afghan men were charged with arson Wednesday for their alleged participation in the fire. 2 more minors are being held by the Greek police but haven't formally been charged. Greece claims the fire was started by a small group of asylum seekers in protest over conditions at the camp, which had been locked down due to the coronavirus pandemic. This is 23-year-old Aman Ullah from Kabul, Afghanistan, who'd been in the Moria camp for almost a year.
We want a free life. We have come here to live. We are humans. We are not animals. They put us in this place where there is no life, and it's like a jungle. A human cannot live in such tents. And if people live here for just 1 or 3 days, they will be fed up with the situation. We urge the Greek government to let us get out of here because life is tough here. We have experienced hunger and thirst here. It has been for days that I didn't drink clean water, and I didn't have food. I'm searching for water. Otherwise, our children and I will die of thirst.
Refugees have been protesting the conditions, pleading for help for other European nations. Some of the asylum seekers, many of them women and children, are demanding they be allowed to leave the island of Lesbos, but the Greek government's refusing to relocate most people displaced by the fire to the mainland. Over the weekend, police fired tear gas on the demonstrators. On Tuesday, the Greek government asked the European Union to help run refugee camps on the country's islands where tens of thousands of refugees live. This all comes as Greece's conservative government has implemented increasingly hostile anti-immigrant policies in recent years. For more, we go to the island of Lesbos, where we're joined by reporter Franziska Grillmeyer, who's been closely following this. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Franziska. Explain the situation. Human Rights Watch called that camp that burned down unsanitary and dangerous. Now what happens to the homeless refugees?
So at the moment, the people are moving very slowly into the new camp structure, but very reluctantly, I have to say, because people are really fearing to just face another prison situation like they faced for the past weeks and months and years. So this is why most of the people were staying out on the streets for 8 nights now. So the fire happened 1 week ago, and people were fleeing really with all they had on their body into the streets, and were blocked in one street part in between the camp and the main city of Mytilene. And they have stayed there now for 8 days, mostly, as we just heard, also without any running and clean water, without any sufficient food supplies, without electricity. And so, you know, you have to imagine people they didn't have diapers for their children, they didn't have toilet paper. Most of them are families, and they have elderly, they have people in wheelchairs. And we as press, we couldn't really approach the site in the last 4 days, so we had to find alternative ways in order to get to the people. The same with humanitarian aid and doctors, and any medical and legal assistance wasn't allowed through. I mean, not frequently. This was really a problem, so the people felt left alone, are highly desperate at this point. Many fainted on the way because you have a lot of medical cases still inside who weren't treated in the old camp structure. So at the moment, it's a real desperation, and the calculation of the Greek government was, in my opinion, to really break the people's spirit at this moment in order to go into the new camp facility. Many fear because it's a symbol of re-traumatization and, no safety for them.
Francesca, could you talk about the people who've been arrested, the refugees who've been held responsible for these fires, and also if a fire, certainly of this scale, is unprecedented, or whether there have been smaller incidents in other camps on various Greek islands?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this fire is just a symbol of the many fires that burn daily in people's lives there. I mean, many fires physically broke out and also killed many people in the last years, but also a fire symbolically is really in not getting any medical treatment and not getting any school or medication into pharmacies. You can't just walk out, you know, and pull up, I don't know, a bathing suit and go swimming or go to the cinema. It's not the case inside of these camps. These are not really camp structures. This is really, many people felt like a prison and ghettos, and this was really a foreseeable and dangerous backlash of this political calculation of the European Union to deter people from coming. So you could really feel the camp is architected in a way, or it's an architecture of deterrence. So we were really wondering why it didn't go up in flames, you know, earlier in a way that, I mean, not that we calculated this catastrophe in, but at the moment, I mean, the Greek government is framing people, criminalizing people since years now who are seeking shelter in Europe. And this is also the European member states who are supporting this framing. And so what we see now is that, yes, 4 people got arrested. However, the question should not really be, and it's not clear yet who really, like, what factors led to the fire, if there were also local responses in it or not. However, really the question should be at this point, like, how could it sustain for so long? And why are we watching for 8 days now people in severe dehydration and no safety? And it is no political failure. It's really political calculation, what we see behind it. And it's kind of this, you get a bit distracted from the political calculation when you have someone to blame. And blaming the refugees and asylum seekers at this point is also calculation.
Francesca, well, you know, Moria, as we mentioned earlier, is the largest refugee camp, was the largest refugee camp across Europe because Greece is the main port of entry to Europe for these refugees. And as far as the rest of the EU is concerned, it's only Germany has taken in over 1 million refugees and has now said that it will take an additional 1,500 refugees from Greece. Could you talk about where the remaining countries in Europe stand? Because Greece does bear a disproportionate burden for the care of these refugees, and the 2016 EU-Turkey agreement and how that altered the flow of migrants into Europe.
Yes, absolutely. So what we can see at the moment is really the result of an externalization campaign by the European member states, which means that you shift the responsibility absolutely towards the border countries and to the Aegean Islands, as we see it here in Greece at the moment. So not shouldering any responsibility from many member states of the EU and pushing Greece also to the margins. Really pushing them over the brink, actually, in the share they have to take at this point. But also, what we see now is that you really have the European member states saying, well, Greece is the shield of Europe. So, I mean, these kind of camps are built on human rights violations. The border deterrence is built on human rights violations at the moment. We see illegal pushbacks carried out since weeks and months now on these Aegean sea strips, which means that the EU member states are actually in favor of Greece's hard stand against refugees and asylum seekers and supporting this. And this is, I mean, we've really seen it in the past year now, that the Geneva Conventions are not functionable anymore, that I mean, after 2016, the EU member states said, OK, we want to control the situation, and they made a deal with Turkey to secure the borders, so much less people arrived in opposite to 2015. So the people were stuck on these islands and had to wait for the asylum procedure to get through. But the problem was that many people, that the bureaucracy didn't work very well, that it's, as I said before, like the whole camp was designed to deter the people from coming. And so there was no political will in order to better the situation for those people, in order to say, well, look, if you arrive in Europe, then you don't necessarily get a better future. And there was always this narrative also of putting me and them, like, of othering. Definitely, it was never like you could really feel that there were fences built around people seeking asylum here in Europe, and it just transformed more and more into a black box where human rights advocates and journalists didn't get enough entry really to cover the violations, the gross violations. And this is what we see now in these last years, and now really culminating into the fire, into also the situation now where people's spirit is really broken in order to go into a closed camp, because this was the strategy of the Greek government from the beginning of this year, saying that they want to transform open structures into prison camps, in a way, into closed structures, so that,
Francisca, we have to go. We have 30 seconds. But Nermeen and I were in the what was known as the Jungle, the largest refugee camp in France a few years ago. And now we see this camp where the overwhelming majority are Afghans. Can you make the final link? Yes, we're in the midst of the pandemic, but between the refugees and war, the U.S. still involved in its longest war in U.S. history, and that is in Afghanistan, where so many of these refugees are from.
So, I mean, yes, it's 79% are Afghan, and mostly Afghan families. And people are really trying to seek shelter at this point. And most of them don't have any safe third country in Turkey also. So there's nowhere to go from this point onwards for them.
Francisca Grillmeyer, we thank you so much for being with us from the Greek island of Lesbos, where the largest refugee camp in Europe has just burned down. When we come back, we go to Pentagon paper whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, who just testified yesterday at the extradition hearing of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange in Britain. Stay with us. The refugee band Khabezdal. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. As we turn now to the press freedom case unfolding in London, where Julian Assange, founder and editor-in-chief of WikiLeaks, is fighting extradition to the United States over an ever-evolving array of espionage and hacking charges. Assange faces almost certain conviction if extradited here, and 175 years in prison. U.S. prosecutors allege he conspired with whistleblower Chelsea Manning, who had been a private in the U.S. Army, to illegally download hundreds of thousands of war logs from Iraq and Afghanistan, along with a huge trove of classified cables from the U.S. State Department. Experts have lined up to defend Assange, including the legendary Pentagon's paper whistleblower Dan Ellsberg, who testified Wednesday at the extradition via video stream from his home in California, in Berkeley. In 1971, Ellsberg was a high-level Pentagon analyst when he leaked a top-secret report on U.S. involvement in Vietnam that became known as the Pentagon Papers, which documented how officials had lied to the public about the war. Like Assange, Ellsberg provided the leaked documents to the New York Times. Also like Assange, Ellsberg was charged under the Espionage Act and could have spent the rest of his life behind bars, though a judge threw out his case when it was revealed that President Nixon had ordered criminal break-ins seeking damaging information on him. Dan Ellsberg joins us now from Berkeley. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Dan. We don't have that much time, but talk about why you testified at the extradition hearing, asking that Julian Assange not be sent to the United States, though we should say he has basically been in captivity for almost 8 years now, having gone into the Ecuadorian embassy where he got political refuge, but was there for years before a new right-wing government in Ecuador revoked that political asylum status. And the British authorities came in and ousted him and brought him to the Belmarsh prison, the high-security prison in Britain.
Yes, I'd like to focus, Amy, on the larger implications of this case, since we only have a minute or two. Really, the American press has remained in kind of a state of denial for 40 years, really, since my case, that the Espionage Act has wording in it that could be aimed directly at them, at the journalists and publishers, although until this case, it hasn't done so. So now the American press is staring right down the barrel at the use of the Espionage Act against American journalists and publishers for doing journalism, for doing what they do best, at their best every day, of getting information that the government doesn't want known to the public because of their wrongdoing, their lies, their crimes, whatever. There's a lot of those, and that's what is mainly the secrecy system is intended to protect indefinitely. Now, it's not only American journalists here, although the American First Amendment, the core of our form of government, I would say, is at stake at this right now and is being attacked. Actually, if Julian is extradited, as I say, as you said, it will lead to prosecution here and probably conviction, and he will be the first journalist and publisher, but not the last. New York Times probably won't be the second either. It might be the third or the fourth, and you, Amy, as well. So everybody has a stake in this. Meanwhile, if Julian is extradited to the United States to face these charges for doing the journalism that he has, the charges that are made against him, no journalist in the world is safe from life imprisonment in the United States of America. So the stakes here are enormous, and for freedom of the press anywhere. Ours is far from perfect. Other places have less, a few have more. But the possibility of freedom of the press, and thus of democracy, is at stake all over the world in this. That sounds almost certainly like hyperbole, and it isn't. Now, the prosecution proved yesterday that they're basing a lot of the case, first of all, on not so much with me, but with other witnesses, on the fact that Chelsea Manning was encouraged by Julian to give this information, and he actually asked for documents. I can't count the number of times I've been asked for documents, as was quite proper for journalists. So that conspiracy is something that every source goes through with every journalist who uses sources. On the question of what the damage he has done, the government is seeking to focus on the fact that names, unredacted, were subject in their minds, and quite understandably, plausibly, to danger in the countries where they were by being published. As I pointed out to the prosecutor, the way to stop that danger from occurring was to stop the publication of those names. And those were not names that either the media or WikiLeaks or Julian Assange wanted to put out. On the contrary, the media and the government was well aware, the media was participating, that they were making enormous efforts to redact from this mass of documents the names of anyone who might be put in a feeling of anxiety or danger, or might be in real danger. And they called on the government to supply those names that they could take out. It was in the government's capability to prevent those people, not all of whom they could get in touch with, from even being revealed at all, even being in a state of anxiety, and they chose not to do it. They have total responsibility for the anxiety, the fleeing of some of them from their countries, total responsibility, I would say, the government, since they could have prevented that, and they chose not to. I can only infer that they preferred to reserve these charges against Julian Assange eventually, rather than to protect those people from the possible danger that they were put in. Finally, it's utmost cynical, as I was listening just now to the reports you're making. We're talking of people who are refugees from a state of war that the United States initiated, first with attack on Afghanistan, but in particular with its aggression against Iraq. And I did mention this the other day to the prosecutor, that it's, I can only say cynical, I could use other words, to say that the government, our government, is worried about 100 or 200 people being made anxious and concerned, and some of them asking to leave the country with U.S. help. To be concerned about those people when this government has led to the flight of 37 million refugees from the American-initiated wars, the plight of some of whom you've just described, it's a mockery. And if this trial is successful, if the extradition is successful, already that will have an intimidating effect on journalists around the world and be a direct attack on the First Amendment of the United States.
Daniel Ellsberg, we want to thank you for being with us. Again, one of the world's most famous whistleblowers. He testified at Julian Assange's extradition hearing on Wednesday. And just to be clear, Julian Assange, from being under house arrest in Britain to holing up in the Ecuadorian embassy for over 7 years, to being at Belmarsh, the high-security prison, for a year and a half, has been actually in captivity for more than a decade. That does it for our show. To see our interview with one of his lawyers, Jennifer Robinson, go to democracynow.org. That does it for our show. A special happy belated birthday to Sam Alcoff. Democracy Now! Is produced with Renee Feltz, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Libby Rainey, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamery Astudio, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud, Adriana Contreras. Special thanks to Julie Crosby, Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Grant, Dennis Moynihan, David Prude, and Dennis McCormick. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Shaikh. Stay safe. Wear a mask.